A fool will drag you down and beat you with experience. Outsmart, don't engage. This ancient wisdom reveals itself every day in boardrooms, classrooms, and online debates where intelligent people find themselves losing arguments they should easily win. A brilliant executive once spent 3 hours trying to convince a colleague that 2 + 2 = 4. The colleague insisted it equaled 5. By the end, half the room was confused about basic arithmetic, the quarterly planning was derailed, and the executive had unknowingly demonstrated why Niccolò Machiavelli warned against one of the most dangerous traps in human interaction: competing with fools. Never argue with a fool, goes the old saying. Onlookers may not be able to tell the difference. But Machiavelli's insight cuts deeper than simple advice about arguments. In The Prince and his other works, he identified something more sinister: how engaging with intellectual dishonesty doesn't just waste time. It actively corrupts your own strategic position and transforms you into the very thing you're fighting against. In a world where misinformation spreads faster than truth, where social media rewards outrage over accuracy, and where the loudest voice often drowns out the most informed one, understanding Machiavelli's rule about mental warfare isn't just useful. It's essential for anyone who wants to maintain their sanity and effectiveness in an increasingly chaotic world. The fool isn't just wrong. The fool has weaponized being wrong, turning ignorance into a competitive advantage that rational people consistently underestimate. The fool's hidden advantage. Machiavelli understood that political power often flows not to the most capable, but to those who best understand the game being played. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved, he wrote. But there's a third category he observed in Renaissance courts: those who were neither loved nor feared, yet somehow wielded disproportionate influence through sheer persistence and immunity to shame. The fool operates with advantages that rational people don't possess and often don't recognize. First, the fool has no reputation to protect. While you carefully consider how each statement affects your credibility, the fool speaks without concern for consistency or accuracy. This creates an asymmetric battlefield where you're constrained by logic, evidence, and social consequences, while your opponent faces none of these limitations. Second, the fool benefits from unlimited ammunition. Because they're not bound by facts, they can generate an endless stream of arguments, accusations, and distractions. Each time you debunk one claim, 3 more appear. Each time you provide evidence, they shift the goalposts. The rational person operates with finite energy and finite patience. The fool operates with neither constraint. Third, and most importantly, the fool fights a different war than the one you think you're fighting. You believe you're engaged in a contest of ideas, seeking truth or reaching understanding. The fool is engaged in a contest of attention, seeking to exhaust your resources and frustrate your objectives. You're playing chess while they're playing a game where the only rule is that there are no rules. This dynamic explains why intelligent people often lose public debates to less knowledgeable opponents. The prepared participant arrives with facts, logic, and reasoned arguments. The unprepared participant arrives with sound bites, emotional appeals, and a willingness to say anything that generates reaction. Machiavelli would recognize this pattern immediately. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, he observed, for everyone can see and few can feel. The fool understands intuitively that perception matters more than reality, that appearing to win matters more than actually being right. The energy drain. Beyond tactical disadvantages, engaging with fools creates a more insidious problem that Machiavelli understood: the gradual corruption of your own mental processes. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner brings about his destruction than his preservation, he warned. Spending significant time refuting nonsense doesn't just waste energy, it reshapes how you think about legitimate challenges. When you regularly engage with bad faith arguments, you develop bad faith reflexes. You begin assuming malicious intent where none exists. You start preparing for gotcha questions instead of genuine inquiry. You shift from building ideas to defending positions. Gradually, the fool's approach becomes your approach, not because you choose it, but because constant exposure creates unconscious adaptation. This transformation happens incrementally and often invisibly. The executive who spends months dealing with one unreasonable colleague starts treating all disagreement as unreasonable. The teacher who argues with disruptive students begins seeing all questions as challenges to authority. The fool's greatest victory isn't winning individual arguments. It's making you think like a fool. The energy drain operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Intellectually, you waste cognitive resources on problems that don't deserve serious attention. Emotionally, you experience frustration and anger that affects your decision-making in unrelated areas. Socially, you damage relationships by bringing conflict-oriented approaches to peaceful interactions. Most dangerously, this drain is often invisible to the person experiencing it. You don't notice how much mental bandwidth the fool consumes until you step away from the engagement entirely. Only then do you realize how much clearer your thinking becomes and how much more effectively you handle legitimate challenges when you're not constantly prepared for illegitimate ones. The fool as mental virus. Machiavelli understood contagion long before germ theory. He recognized that bad ideas, like diseases, spread through contact, and that exposure to certain types of thinking could infect even disciplined minds. The fool operates as a mental virus, spreading chaos not through superior arguments, but through superior persistence and immunity to reason. Like biological viruses, mental viruses exploit the host's normal functions for their own reproduction. Your natural tendency to engage with challenges, to seek understanding, and to resolve disagreements becomes the mechanism through which foolish thinking spreads. The more seriously you take the fool's arguments, the more mental space they occupy. This viral quality explains why foolish ideas often spread faster than good ones. Good ideas require understanding, evaluation, and thoughtful consideration. Foolish ideas require only emotional reaction and social transmission. The person sharing accurate information must convince others through evidence and logic. The person sharing misinformation needs only to trigger outrage, fear, or tribal identification. The viral metaphor extends to the fool's impact on organizations and communities. One person operating in bad faith can consume disproportionate organizational resources, derail productive meetings, and force everyone else to operate defensively rather than constructively. The fool becomes a black hole of attention, sucking energy and focus away from legitimate priorities. Understanding this viral quality reveals why Machiavelli's advice about avoiding engagement isn't just personal wisdom, it's organizational necessity. The fool's influence spreads through engagement, not despite it. The more attention you give to foolish arguments, the more credible they appear to observers. Recognizing the fool, Machiavelli emphasized the importance of accurate assessment in all strategic situations. There are three classes of intellects, he wrote: one which comprehends by itself, another which appreciates what others comprehend, and a third which neither comprehends by itself nor by the showing of others. The third category represents the fool, not merely ignorant, but incapable of learning from either direct experience or external instruction. The fool isn't simply someone who disagrees with you or holds different values. Reasonable people can disagree about complex issues while maintaining intellectual honesty and good faith engagement. The fool operates differently, displaying specific characteristics that distinguish them from legitimate intellectual opponents. First, the fool argues from conclusion to premise rather than from premise to conclusion. They begin with a desired outcome and work backward to find supporting arguments, no matter how weak or contradictory. When presented with evidence that challenges their conclusion, they don't modify their position. They find new arguments to support the same conclusion. Second, the fool employs unlimited scope creep in discussions. Unable to defend their original position, they continuously expand the scope of disagreement until the conversation becomes about everything and therefore about nothing. What begins as a specific factual dispute transforms into a broad philosophical argument, then into personal attacks. Third, the fool demonstrates selective skepticism that always favors their preferred conclusion. They demand extraordinary evidence for claims they dislike while accepting extraordinary claims they prefer with minimal scrutiny. They question sources, methodology, and motives only when doing so supports their position. Fourth, the fool employs emotional manipulation when logical arguments fail. They interpret disagreement as personal attack, factual correction as disrespect, and requests for evidence as unreasonable demands. They shift from discussing ideas to questioning motives, from addressing arguments to attacking character. These characteristics distinguish the fool from the merely mistaken. Mistaken people adjust their positions when presented with better information. Fools double down, deflect, and diversify their errors while maintaining absolute confidence in their conclusions. The art of non-engagement. Machiavelli's strategic wisdom extended beyond knowing what to do to knowing what not to do. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him, he wrote, recognizing that choosing not to engage can be as important as choosing to engage. Non-engagement doesn't mean avoiding all difficult conversations or challenging interactions. It means recognizing when engagement serves your objectives and when it undermines them. The key distinction lies in assessing whether your counterpart is capable of good faith reasoning and whether the conversation has potential for productive resolution. When dealing with legitimate intellectual opponents, engagement can be valuable even when agreement isn't reached. Such conversations can refine your understanding, expose weaknesses in your reasoning, and demonstrate respect for alternative viewpoints. When dealing with fools, engagement serves none of these purposes and actively undermines your strategic position. Effective non-engagement requires multiple approaches depending on the context. In professional settings, you might acknowledge the fool's input without addressing its substance, then redirect attention to actionable issues with other participants. In social situations, you might change the subject or politely excuse yourself rather than prolonging fruitless discussion. The art lies in non-engagement that doesn't appear dismissive or arrogant to observers. Machiavelli understood that maintaining authority requires careful attention to appearances. Refusing to engage must look like strength rather than weakness, confidence rather than fear, strategic choice rather than inability to respond. One effective approach involves setting clear boundaries about productive discussion before problems arise. By establishing standards for evidence, logical consistency, and good faith engagement in advance, You create legitimate grounds for withdrawal when those standards aren't met. The strategic withdrawal. Machiavelli understood that retreat could be as strategically valuable as advance when executed properly. A prince should therefore be very slow to believe and to act, he counseled, recognizing that premature engagement often proves more dangerous than delayed response. The timing of withdrawal matters enormously. Disengaging too early might suggest you lack confidence in your position. Disengaging too late means you've already wasted significant energy and given the fool a platform they didn't deserve. The optimal moment comes when you've demonstrated good faith engagement, but before the interaction becomes obviously circular or hostile. Signs that withdrawal is appropriate include repetitive arguments that ignore your responses, personal attacks that replace substantive discussion, or scope creep that expands the disagreement beyond manageable boundaries. When the fool begins employing these tactics, continued engagement legitimizes their approach while degrading your own position. The method of withdrawal should preserve your authority while minimizing the fool's ability to claim victory. Simply walking away without explanation can appear weak. Explaining at length why you're withdrawing gives the fool more ammunition. The most effective approach typically involves a brief, dignified statement that you've reached the limits of productive discussion and prefer to focus your energy on more constructive activities. Strategic withdrawal also requires clear objectives about what you hope to accomplish by disengaging. Understanding your withdrawal objectives helps you execute them more effectively and resist the temptation to re-engage when the fool inevitably tries to draw you back in. Protecting your mental territory. Machiavelli wrote extensively about territorial defense, understanding that the most effective protection comes from preventing invasion rather than repelling it after it occurs. It is far better to be feared than loved, he observed, partly because fear creates distance that love does not. This principle applies equally to mental territory. Protecting your cognitive resources requires establishing boundaries before they're tested. Your mental territory includes your attention, your emotional energy, your intellectual focus, and your decision-making capacity. Fools invade this territory not through superior arguments, but through persistence, emotional manipulation, and sheer volume of interaction. Establishing clear boundaries around your mental territory requires both internal discipline and external communication. Internally, you must develop the capacity to recognize when your mental resources are being wasted on unproductive engagement. This means paying attention to your emotional state during interactions and your ability to focus on important tasks when dealing with disruptive influences. The protection of mental territory also requires understanding that your attention is a finite and valuable resource that should be allocated strategically rather than reactively. Every moment spent arguing with a fool is a moment not spent on activities that could advance your actual objectives. Machiavelli would appreciate the economic nature of this calculation. Just as a prince must allocate military resources strategically rather than responding to every minor threat, you must allocate mental resources based on strategic importance rather than emotional urgency. The fool's greatest weapon is their ability to make their nonsense seem urgent and important. Your greatest defense is maintaining perspective about what actually deserves your attention. The social dynamics of foolishness. One of Machiavelli's most sophisticated insights concerned how individual behavior affects group dynamics and social structures. He understood that tolerating certain behaviors essentially encourages them, while setting clear standards helps maintain social order. When respected members of a group engage seriously with foolish arguments, they inadvertently lower the group's standards for reasonable discourse. Other members observe this engagement and conclude that such arguments merit consideration, making them more likely to advance similar arguments or take them seriously when others do. This dynamic explains why organizations with strong cultures often have informal but clear boundaries around acceptable behavior and discussion. New members quickly learn what kinds of arguments receive serious consideration and what kinds are politely ignored or firmly redirected. These cultural norms protect everyone's time and energy while maintaining focus on productive activities. Machiavelli understood that individual actions create precedents that affect future expectations and behavior. When you engage with a fool's arguments as if they deserve serious consideration, you establish a precedent that similar arguments will receive similar treatment. Conversely, when you consistently refuse to engage with foolish arguments while remaining open to reasonable disagreement, you help establish social norms that protect everyone from time-wasting and energy-draining interactions. Your individual boundary setting contributes to a broader culture that values productive discourse over performative conflict. The power of strategic indifference. The ultimate expression of Machiavellian wisdom regarding fools isn't anger, frustration, or even contempt. It's strategic indifference. The best fortress which a prince can possess is the affection of the people, Machiavelli wrote. Recognizing that the strongest position comes not from defeating enemies, but from making their opposition irrelevant. Strategic indifference differs from mere ignoring or avoidance. It represents a conscious choice to allocate your attention and energy based on strategic value rather than emotional reaction. The fool's arguments don't anger you because you don't grant them sufficient importance to generate anger. Their provocations don't frustrate you because you don't accept the premise that they deserve response. This indifference must be genuine rather than performed, because fools are often skilled at detecting insincerity and will escalate their behavior when they sense that they're actually getting under your skin. True strategic indifference comes from understanding that the fool's opinion has no bearing on your actual capabilities, objectives, or worth. Developing strategic indifference requires practice and often feels unnatural initially, especially for people who are accustomed to engaging seriously with all challenges to their ideas or authority. It means accepting that some people will misinterpret your position, that some arguments will go unanswered, and that some conflicts will remain unresolved. The power of strategic indifference lies in its liberation of your mental resources for productive purposes. When you no longer feel compelled to respond to every foolish argument, you discover how much energy you were unconsciously dedicating to unworthy concerns. When others observe that foolish arguments don't affect you, they're less likely to employ similar tactics and more likely to engage with you in good faith. Your demonstrated immunity to nonsense actually elevates the quality of discourse around you by establishing higher standards for what merits your attention. The fool's final lesson. Machiavelli's greatest insights often came from observing what didn't work rather than what did. The fool's behavior, while counterproductive for their stated objectives, often succeeds in achieving their actual objectives: attention, disruption, and power through chaos. The fool who derails productive meetings may claim to seek better outcomes while actually seeking to prevent outcomes they can't control or understand. The fool who argues against obvious facts may claim to seek truth while actually seeking to make truth irrelevant to decision-making. The fool who demands endless explanation may claim to seek understanding while actually seeking to exhaust others' patience and energy. Once you understand that the fool's stated objectives differ from their actual objectives, their behavior becomes both more predictable and less frustrating. They're not failing to achieve understanding. They're succeeding at preventing it. They're not failing to reach agreement. They're succeeding at creating disagreement. This insight explains why logical arguments, patient explanation, and good faith engagement consistently fail when dealing with fools. These approaches assume that the fool shares your objectives and is simply mistaken about how to achieve them. In reality, the fool often has different objectives that your approach actually helps them achieve. The fool's final lesson is therefore about clarity regarding your own objectives. If you want to reach understanding, you must engage only with people capable of understanding. If you want to solve problems, you must work only with people who acknowledge that problems exist and can be solved. Machiavelli understood that effectiveness requires choosing your battles based on what you can actually accomplish, rather than what you feel obligated to attempt. The fool presents battles that cannot be won through the methods that work with reasonable people. The wise person recognizes this limitation and chooses different battles with different people using methods appropriate to those contexts. In a world increasingly filled with foolish arguments, manufactured controversies, and bad faith discourse, Machiavelli's rule of mental warfare becomes not just personal wisdom, but survival strategy. Never compete with a fool, not because you can't win, but because winning against a fool means losing everything that actually matters. The executive who spent 3 hours proving that 2 + 2 = 4 discovered this lesson too late. By the end of that meeting, the quarterly planning was derailed, the team's confidence was shaken, and half the room was questioning basic arithmetic. The fool had achieved their objective, creating chaos and confusion, while the executive had failed to achieve theirs, productive planning and clear direction. The real victory would have been refusing the engagement entirely, maintaining focus on the actual agenda, and preserving everyone's time and energy for work that could actually advance the organization's goals. Sometimes the most intelligent response to foolishness isn't a brilliant argument. It's the strategic wisdom to walk away and let your results speak louder than any words ever could.